Hello everyone, welcome back to Horror Hype. But before starting the video, if you enjoy true horror stories, then consider giving us a like. Thank you. My parents got a divorce when I was in 8th grade, and after my dad moved out, my mom was single and looking for a new partner. So she often left me home alone, but when I knew my mom wouldn't be coming home, I usually had a friend stay over for the night so I wouldn't be completely alone. One night, my friend Jess was staying with me. We were in the garage, where we had a good internet connection. We were just playing around on MySpace and stuff, when suddenly we started to hear what sounded like two people talking. Jess and I stopped talking and tried to listen to the people's voices. Then we got up and stood near the garage door, but we couldn't understand what they were saying. I quickly went inside and peeked through the small hole in my front door. I saw two men standing in my driveway near the garage, and it scared me a lot because they weren't on the sidewalk. They were close to my garage, like they belonged there. I watched them for a little while, and then one of them started coming towards the door. I quietly checked to make sure both locks on the door were secure. Then, I looked back at the men. One of them was leaning over the porch railing, trying to see into my mom's bedroom window. I quickly told Jess to get some knives and be careful. I kept an eye on the two men outside. Jess wanted to know what was going on, so I asked her to make sure all the doors were locked while I watched. She came back fast, and we swapped positions. She kept an eye on them, and I searched for the home phone because back then, not many teens had cell phones. All of a sudden, Jess said, "They're leaving." I felt really worried though, because my gut told me they weren't actually going. Without thinking, I asked her, "Did you lock the side door in the garage?" She hadn't, and I dashed through the kitchen into the garage just as I heard the gate by her side open. I rushed to the door and locked the big lock before I could lock the handle. The handle turned, and it made me feel really sick. I grabbed the handle and locked it before running back inside. At that point, I ran to the back door and shouted, "Lock the windows!" My back door had see-through curtains, so you could kind of see inside and outside. Before I could get to the door to lock it, I saw someone coming towards the back porch. I quickly hid behind the couch and watched as he tried to open the back door. Then another guy joined him. Jess walked into the living room and I grabbed her and pulled her down behind the couch with me. We both sat there quietly, feeling scared, and watched these two guys trying to figure out how to get inside. I started crying, and Jess was just sitting there shaking. It felt like a very long time, but eventually the two guys went into the backyard. We heard them making noise, and then they walked by the porch again and left through the side gate. I hurried to the front and looked through the peephole. I saw them walking across the street and getting into a car. I told Jess they were gone. Both of us burst into tears and hugged each other. We called her aunt, and she came to pick us up. We went to her house and stayed there for the night. We didn't tell anyone else because we were afraid we'd get into trouble for some reason. But after that, I didn't stay home alone for a long time. Even now, at 25, I still get scared when it's just my daughter and me at home when my husband is at work, or when he goes out with friends. We were fortunate that it didn't end up worse, but I'm still scared by it, even 12 years later. I grew up in Las Vegas. I moved there when I was in 2nd grade, around 7 years old. My mom had a job at a motorcycle repair shop in Arizona, but it didn't pay enough to cover our expenses. So, when she got a new job offer, she took it. Fast forward 2 years, and I was in middle school. My brother and I were close in age, with me about to turn 12 and him around 10. Because my mom had less seniority at her new job, she had to work late nights. This meant that my brother and I were often home alone after school. Our evenings were pretty simple, as we'd try to avoid doing our homework, heat up leftovers in the microwave, and watch whatever caught our interest on TV. Usually we watched WWE wrestling or some cartoons. Usually we'd go to bed before our mom got home, but sometimes we'd stay up to wait for her. One evening, well, it was still very sunny outside, so it felt more like the afternoon. Everything seemed pretty usual. My brother was sitting on the living room floor, watching whatever was on TV, and I was using my mum's computer to take care of my virtual pets. Then, there was a loud knock at the door, which was quite strange. I didn't have many friends, and neither did my brother. Also, we lived in a place where mostly older people lived. My mom was one of the youngest adults there, in her mid-30s. My brother couldn't see through the door's peephole because he was too short, so he didn't move much, but he looked at me. So I quietly got up from the computer chair and went to the front door to look through the tiny hole. I saw a man wearing a black ski mask looking right back at me through it. It felt like something you'd see in a movie, like he was dressed up to rob a bank. I got really scared, and I didn't even think to ask who it was, and stepped back a bit, turned off the TV, then grabbed my brother and our small black Pomeranian. We hurried to my bedroom and hid in my closet. I told my brother about the person I saw outside. He didn't say much, but he looked really scared and just stood there holding our dog. I took out the small flip phone my mom had left for emergencies from my pocket and called 911. I talked quietly to the operator during the whole call because the man was still there, knocking on the door even after we left the living room. Somehow she understood me and sent a police officer. Right after I hung up with the operator, I called our mom and told her everything. She left work and was on her way home around the same time the police were coming. But I'm not sure why the man decided to leave, as he was gone when they both got there. So the police officer didn't seem to take it seriously. He probably thought we, being young boys home alone, were just scared for no reason. He said it might have been a young guy playing a prank on his friend. But, like I said, we lived in a place for older folks. Who would a person want to play a trick on their grandma? The police officer gave us stickers, as if that could make us feel better after seeing a masked man banging hard on our door. Luckily, I never saw that stranger again. However, after that disturbing incident, our house got broken into, and my car got broken into 3 times. Thankfully, we weren't there when any of those happened. After that, my family moved to a different state and got a security system to stay safe.
The story happened to my grandfather back when he was a teenager. He and his girlfriend, now my grandmother, had just had a nasty fight and broke up, which devastated him. His dad decided that sometime doing his favorite thing might cheer him up, and so they went camping. This had my grandfather up and about the second he heard about it because camping has been and always will be one of his most passionate hobbies. My grandfather mentioned that when they were driving to the campsite, he had this unbreakable feeling that something was off. He later realized that once they drove past a certain point, he had stopped hearing any animals from the wilderness around him. No birds, no sight of the occasional moose, nothing. Fast forward to later when they were at the campsite. Now, it wasn't just him and his father there at the campsite. There was a Mexico family that was camping not far from them, and they even shared a dinner with them and swapped stories. It was later that night, when everything started to happen. My grandfather woke up inside the tent they had set up with the urge to, make a pit stop. So he quickly unzipped the tent and dashed into the woods, flashlight in hand. He made his way a while from the campsite, as to not stink up the air, and he did his business. Now, as he started walking back, he realized that he must have gone a lot further than he thought, because it was taking a good amount of time to get back to the actual campsite, and it was at that same time that he felt he was being watched. So he picked up the pace a little, and he began to feel the full weight of the situation. He was in the middle of nowhere, not even sure if he was walking the right direction, and he felt like something was following him, closely. He says he started to feel like he was on the verge of tears. He was that terrified. It was then that he heard a branch snap on a tree behind him, causing him to whirl around to see nothing on the ground. But there was certainly something in the trees. Something big, with pale white skin, and it was incredibly lanky. He didn't remember why, but then he started crying, and he was laughing at the same time. Then the creature began to move toward him, which snapped him out of it and made him scream, before he began to run at full pace back through the forest. He didn't dare look back at whatever it was that was chasing him, but he knew it was right behind him, and it was gaining on him at that. He then tripped and fell face first on a rock, immediately blacking out. He woke up with his dad and the Mexico family's mother and son standing over him, while the dad looked for whatever had destroyed the trees above. It was sure evidence that something had been there. All my grandfather said was, "We need to leave. That thing, it's not human." He tried to plead to his great-grandfather to believe him so that they would all leave. He said this so seriously that my great-grandfather knew that he must not have been lying. He wasn't that type of person. The next day, after some explaining, my grandfather learned that what he saw was probably a Wendigo. Now, of course, the Mexico family didn't stay long after explaining this, and neither did my family. My grandfather claims this story is 100% true, and I don't see what reason he'd have to make it all up. So I trust him. I completely believe that my grandfather encountered a monster in the Canadian woods. Now, I'm just gonna cut right into it. Ever since I could remember, I've been followed by these tall beings with black eyes and large heads. Whether you believe me or not, the fear I have is real. The first encounter I can remember was when I was camping in Mexico with my family to our usual camping spot. It's nothing too special. Late that same night, my cousin and I had to use the bathroom, which was pretty far from where we set up camp, so it was a long walk. As we were walking, I noticed that there were two tall, skinny figures up ahead, looking around. They seemed like they were searching for something. I still don't really know what though. I pointed it out to my cousin, and he looked in their direction. We were both confused and a bit nervous, so we stopped walking, and then both of those things looked at us for a few seconds, and then they walked away. The rest of the trip we never saw anything unusual and had a good time, so we just blew off that sighting. I was only 8 at the time, so I didn't think back on it too much until after my next encounter. This event happened to me and my sister when I was 12, and it's by far the most terrifying for me. I was playing with my sister. I don't remember what we were doing, but we were having a good time of it. We were on the second floor of the house, and the room we were in had a large window, which my sister was facing while I faced away. As my sister was laughing, all of a sudden, her face went dead still, staring right behind me. She looked so serious and somber. This made me curious, so I turned around. I regret that choice to this day because what I saw was this pale creature crouching down, staring through the window at us. It had completely black eyes and a head that seemed too big for its body. It seemed like it didn't have a mouth, with no visible nose. Its skin was gray, but almost seemed white. It was only there for about 5 seconds at most, and it moved out of view. My sister and I were petrified, so much so that we couldn't move. We could only sit there in silence and disbelief. When we could finally move, we went right up to our mom, and like any parent, she blew it off as a child's imagination. I wish she was right, but after that event, I began having these nightmares of being taken from my home and being put on a cold, metal table. I would wake up with cuts on my body, cuts that I couldn't explain, and I even woke up with a gash on my back. Around the age of 14, all of this stopped, and I honestly thought it was over. I was wrong. The final encounter didn't happen to me, but to my aunt. I was 15 when this happened. I had spent the night at my cousin's house when we went to bed. When we finally did go to bed, it was really late, as we had stayed up playing video games. That night, though, his dogs were barking nonstop and violently, but it wasn't too uncommon for them to do that. They were fairly aggressive for being small dogs. So we just stayed in bed. I went home the morning after, but that following night, the dogs began barking and snarling again. So my aunt went out to check on them, and she saw the same exact thing that I saw years ago, but it was crawling over her fence into her backyard. She simply watched the thing. It kept walking into the backyard until it finally saw her, and it stood motionless, as if wondering if it had been caught. She told me it made a strange hissing noise at her, and then ran back to the fence and climbed up it in seconds. When my aunt told me this story of hers, chills went down my spine. Needless to say, my aunt didn't sleep that night. I'm turning 18 soon, and I sometimes feel like I'm being watched, or I'll hear something run away from my window at night. That alone is nightmare fuel for me. I don't know what they want from me, or why they follow me around, but I want it to stop. Luckily, though, after I got my cat, everything seemed to slow down, and now I can't sleep unless my cat's in the room with me. Whatever those things are, I hope they'll leave me alone for good. Around April or May of this year, 2016, my girlfriend and I went on a camping trip. Being from Michigan, places to camp are extremely plentiful. But who really wants to go to a campsite and deal with other people? So we decided the place for us to go would be the Manistee National Forest. It's a massive area of woodland hills. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. Anyway, we were driving around the forest, and I pull into a small clearing off a dirt road. We scout around and decide to keep looking for other areas we can camp out at, keeping that area locked into our minds so it can stay there if we don't find a better spot. We drive maybe a mile away and we turn down an overgrown trail. My car was barely high enough to not scrape along the ground. Mind you, I drive in 014 Ford Taurus. After driving about 200 yards in, we see a little clearing and decide that's where we want to camp out. We set everything up, gather firewood, and go for a stroll through the woods. It was pretty awesome. About 50 yards away from that campsite, there is a nice-sized hole dug into a little ledge off of a trail. I was curious about it, and I wasn't sure what it was, but it was deep. Maybe a fox den, I thought. We continued walking around without straying too far from the camp, just taking in the beauty of nature. As the sun starts to set, we head to camp, and I dig out a fire pit and start a fire. As we were sitting there talking and making some lunch, we hear a very loud truck down the original trail we veered off of, but we can hear it stop and idle at what sounds like the turnoff. We never saw it with the curve of the road, but I think they'd be able to see my car from there since I just parked off the path across from our campsite. Suddenly, the truck turns around and drives off quickly, and we continue with our day without incident. But at night, things got even stranger. We were all sleeping, but I woke up as the tent began to violently shake. I was tired, and I thought nothing of it, since it had been windy that night. As I fell asleep, I was awoken with the urge to pee. I wake up my girlfriend, and I let her know that I'm stepping outside. I grab my flashlight, more like a spotlight, and I head out. Almost instantly, that feeling of eyes on me was everywhere. I shone the light all around me, but I didn't see a thing. So I chalked it up to paranoia, being an avid horror fan after all. I do my business and I head back in, and that's when I hear it. It's a very guttural cooing, almost like an owl mixed with a dog. It was long and drawn out, and it happened several times, each time lasting for about 3 seconds each. I stood there, listening, and I realized that it sounded like it was right behind our tent. I grabbed my knife, and I woke up my girlfriend. Almost right away, she could hear it as well. In her sleepy haze, she chalked it up as an owl. But I'm from the backwoods, and I know just about every animal sound that would be in Michigan. This was no owl. In fact, it was like nothing I've ever heard. After a couple of minutes, it started to fade away. I didn't hear any footsteps or anything like that. But even still, the sound faded farther and farther away. No footsteps or anything like that, just the sounds getting quieter. I do need to add that behind our tent, where the sound was coming from, was tall grass just under knee height. So there wasn't anything sitting in a tree, and when I looked around with the flashlight, there wasn't even any eye shine. But it sounded way too big to be smaller than the grass, which almost makes me think it was crouched behind the tent. But why? The next day, I talked to my girlfriend about it, but she didn't really remember much of it, so I tried to let it go. We all decided to have one more walk before we finally left. We were walking through the woods again, down this old trail, but it was deathly quiet, unnaturally silent. Thinking back, The whole time we were out there, it was too quiet. We walked deeper and deeper into the beautiful forest until the foliage around us began to die. I don't mean they started to suddenly fade, but the further we got, everything looked dead. Many of the trees looked like they had been torn in half. Both confused and terrified, we turned back shortly after emerging into those dead woods, and we headed out. If anyone knows what we might have seen, I would love to hear your story. I was 17 when this happened. My family and I live in the woods of Colorado. I was going on a hunting trip with my dad. I always loved hunting with my old man, but this experience scared me out of the woods for a while. We were heading to our hunting spot. We even brought along some camping gear to spend the night. When we got there, we unpacked our stuff and set up camp. When that was done, we started to hike down the trail and we're hoping to hunt a buck or an elk, and that'd be pretty awesome. Anyway, while we were walking, we heard some howls from wolves and coyotes, but we weren't worried about them. We were worried about encountering a grizzly bear, but if we did, we'd have just fired off a warning shot. When my dad and I reached the top of the mountain, we gave out some calls to try and attract something. A few minutes of waiting later, we heard elk, but they were only females, no males yet. We continued down the trail calling out, but then my dad stopped me. We saw antlers on a tree stump. My dad thought that another hunter must have been there before us, but in my mind I was thinking, what kind of hunter leaves antlers behind after he's made a successful hunt? Whatever the case was, we continued walking, and as we did, we kept seeing more and more antlers, both deer and elk. I told my dad we should head back to camp, and he agreed. As we made our way back to camp, I started to feel like something was watching us. But I looked around, and there was nothing. A few moments later, we saw a male elk. We both hunkered down, and I raised my rifle. I took a deep breath and then pulled the trigger. It was a direct hit right in the heart. When we got to it, it was already dead. So we went through the process of, well, you know. Then we made it back to camp and started to cook dinner. When my dad finished preparing our meals, we sat down and started talking about old memories while enjoying the sounds of nature. After a while, I brought up those antlers we saw earlier. My dad said he doesn't know why anyone would leave antlers behind. Then suddenly we heard what sounded like footsteps coming from the woods. We didn't see who or what was making the noise clearly, but I did see antlers. But the weird thing was they were 8 feet off the ground, and I could make out glowing eyes. My dad looked in that direction and froze. Suddenly the creature came out of the brushes and we saw its true form. It was like no animal I'd ever seen. Its skin was gray and almost rotten, like bone being covered by skin. It had long arms with very sharp claws and a head that looked like the skull of a wolf with pointy human-like teeth. It roared at us, and my dad and I grabbed our guns. We immediately started shooting at it. It screeched in pain and charged at us. We made a run for it into the woods. As we were running, we could hear that the thing was right behind us. We kept going and then hid behind some large rocks. We stayed as quiet as we could, just hoping the thing didn't have a good sense of smell. Then we heard it run by us. We waited for a minute, then decided to run back to camp. When we got there, we packed up everything as fast as we could and quickly left the area. We made it home before it got dark, and we ran inside. My mom saw us and asked what happened. My dad lied and said we encountered an aggressive grizzly bear. Later that night, we went asleep. I was still shocked about what happened and I just couldn't get my eyes to stay shut. Nothing else ever happened, and we never encountered that thing again. But I firmly believe that what my father and I saw was a wendigo.